Wasson was a Wasson worked for J.P. Morgan. The story in this narrative is that he was a banker for J.P. Morgan, Wall Street banker, and that's kind of true and kind of not true, because when we think of bankers, we think of interest and currency and exchange rates and money stuff. And Gordon Wasson was into public relations. He didn't really work with money so much. He worked with ideas and images. And JP Morgan wasn't just a bank. JP Morgan is a political force, a fascist political force. JP Morgan was a supporter of the Third Reich. He's about the concentration of wealth and the mind control of populations. And he wasn't a terrific guy. And Wasson was his fixer. Okay. And this story, it's a very charming story about how Gordon Wasson is on his honeymoon, and he and his wife find some mushrooms and they have a fight about them. She's from Russia. She loves mushrooms. He's kind of Anglo-Saxon, and they hate them. And they got into this fight the first day of their marriage, and they realized what an interesting thing, that there's this profound difference between not only us as individuals, but us as our cultures. And so that became their hobby, to study mushrooms. This starts in 1927. And then 20 years goes by. They become very voracious readers. They become like world famous mycologists. They invent this field, ethnomycology, the role of mushrooms in society. And then they find out that there was a culture in Mexico that that worshipped mushrooms, that there was a divinity associated with mushrooms, confirming an idea they had back 20 years ago, that this must be some sort of religious thing. And so they go down to Mexico, to the southern mountains of Mexico, and they find this woman, Maria Sabina. And Gordon Wasson becomes, according to the legend, the narrative, the first white man to take these mushrooms in a ceremony, a secret, 5,000-year-long tradition of using mushrooms, and has these profound visions. And then he comes back to the United States, and he writes an article in, you said Time magazine, is actually Life magazine, not that they're very different, because they're all controlled by this other fellow, Henry Luce. We could talk about him, he's important. And this article was like the first. Huxley wrote The Doors of Perception 10 years earlier or so, but Gordon writes this article in the most popular periodical in the United States, maybe in the world, right? Life magazine, front page story about this mushrooms that cause visions. And it's really, psychedelic historians note this as like the big thing, like suddenly this mushroom that's known only to anthropologists and a handful of people, esoteric bohemian stuff, suddenly it's big news. And this is the thing that kind of started, one of the major events that started the psychedelic era. And what I found out that was shocking, first of all, it's shocking enough that it was a Wall Street banker that starts this kind of counterculture thing. But it becomes even more shocking when you realize that this expedition and the publication of the expedition was funded by the CIA. Now, Wasson has a little cover story. You may know, and your listeners can find out, that Wasson was a very private fellow, but he only gave a few interviews in his life. And one of them was to me at the end of his life. And I conducted a very thorough interview of his career. And it's published in my first book. It's published on my website. alteredstatesofamerica.net. Maybe we'll get to that.
Mm-hmm.
But Wasson tells this cover story that, see, the CIA had started this project called MK Ultra, which we'll talk about. A lot of things to talk about here, Noah. And he says that the CIA wanted to go on this trip with him. And first he said no. And then the CIA went around and came up with an agent disguised as a chemistry professor from the University of Delaware. And he said, I've got a foundation. I'm interested in these mushrooms too. And if you let me come, I can pay for the trip. And so Wasson, even though he was wealthy, said, okay, fantastic. But this is a guy named James Moore, and he was a CIA operative. But this is a cover story. We've since found the documents that Wasson was fully aware of this. And that the important point is that the CIA, this Mexico expedition was called MK Ultra Subproject number 58. So now we have to think, well, wait a second here. Here's the CIA, which has only been around for 10 years at this point. Its charter expressly forbids it from operating on American soil. It was set up to be an intelligence gathering apparatus operating overseas to protect us from those bad Russians. But here is an instance where they are secretly funding an expedition to this indigenous society to publicize their religion and popularize it, profane it, really is what happens, and instigate this tremendous movement in America. Why are they doing that? Why are they doing that? That's been a question that began to kind of, obsess me for many years, and still kind of does, because there's just a lot of material there that we need to really look at. Why is the CIA starting the psychedelic movement secretly?
Yeah.
Why are they putting this drug out there?
Yeah, I've become quite obsessed with that question myself too. So I understand that. Your book, jumping around a little bit, to some of the other figures you talked about, your book, Outside Looking In, the collection of essays about Leary and people that knew him. The most fascinating one to me in there is an inclusion you have about correspondence between Timothy Leary and Aldous Huxley, in which Huxley references working with, at the time, a professor of the University of Oklahoma, I believe, and then later UCLA, by the name of Jolly West, who has, of course, been kind of infamized nowadays by some of the work by Tom O'Neill and his discovery of correspondence between Jolly West and Sidney Gottlieb, who was, one of the architects of MK Ultra. Can you talk to me a little bit about Huxley and Jolly West's, potential relationship, and where Leary fits in that equation too?
Yeah, wow, no, you really zero in on
Oh yeah.
One on one of the very key issues. And Jolly West has passed away now, of course. So you mentioned the O'Neill book, which is an extremely important, fairly new book to come out, in which it took him 25 years to write. And I can understand that, because you're dealing with forces here that first of all, the CIA is a very powerful organization, and their mind control operation is very effective. So putting this stuff out, really marginalizes you. This whole, industry of the weaponization of the term conspiracy theory.
Right.
So Tom O'Neill, who was a journalist, needing journalism for his livelihood, had to be very careful about the kinds of things he was writing about, because it's very easy to lose your job and be cast aside. But O'Neill wrote this very important book showing that Jolly West was part of the cultivation of Charles Manson and the deployment of psychedelic drugs to induce chaos in our culture in the 60s. And Jolly West has other credits, sort of, to his career. One of them being that he was the psychiatrist that was called in to treat Jack Ruby,
right,
when Jack Ruby was in prison for killing Lee Harvey Oswald. You know the story that Jack Ruby, or Jack Rubenstein is his
yes,
real name, and he's said to be, have had these underworld connections, and people think, oh, the mafia, but it was a Jewish mafia. And he was instructed to kill Lee Harvey Oswald, and then he was sentenced to a long prison term. And when he was in prison, he kind of like come to Jesus moment, like, hey, I don't want to take the fall for all this. And he started saying that there was this right-wing plot to kill the president, and I don't want, get me out of here. And I will, want to, and so they called in the prison psychiatrist, who was Jolly West, and they diagnosed Jack Ruby as a paranoid schizophrenic or something, and administer antipsychotic medication. And then very soon he's dead from, I don't remember if was fast-acting brain cancer, or was a heart attack or something.
And just a little bit more detail to that interaction with Jolly West. Apparently what happened was, I think he was supposed to testify. I don't know if it was the Warren Commission or the Church Committee, something like that, where he was supposed to go before, he was supposed to provide testimony, and they were worried he was going to start kind of spilling these beans. So when Jolly West came in, he had a meeting with him. And after this meeting, somehow Jack Ruby came out completely incoherent and rambling and hysterical, basically. And the theory is that Jolly West went in there and gave him some sort of psychedelic that just ruined his brain. And there's even a video on YouTube that you can watch that is after this interaction with Jolly West, and Jack Ruby's talking to reporters and stuff. And you can see in his eyes that he is on something, and the things that he's saying are just crazy, outlandish, talking about man's place in the universe and all this stuff. It's just very obvious that he was drugged in this moment.
Well, that's fascinating. I'd like to see that. So
I'll send you that video.
link.
It's crazy.
Yeah, no, I've never seen that. And so it's I forgot that I had those Huxley letters in there, where Huxley, the Huxley Jolly West link.
And he mentions also working with, sorry to interrupt you, he just mentions working to improve John Lilly's methods, or something like that is in that letter with from Huxley.
Yeah, see, Huxley is another one of these characters that I always knew Jolly West was a bad guy. In fact, Frank Barron knew Jolly West. Frank has some connections with CIA that are still a little murky to me. And we talked about the CIA a lot. Frank told me that he was, in his autobiography, a very important book called No Rootless Flower, Frank talks about graduate school at Berkeley, where he and Tim went to the University of California, Berkeley PhD program at what was called IPAR, Institute of Personality Assessment and Research. And Tim has written essays about this, and Frank gets into this. This is basically, there's so much history. OSS, the World War II intelligence operation of the Allies at the end of the war, disbanded. And part of it went to Harvard and became the Department of Social Relations at Harvard. Part of it went to Washington and became the Central Intelligence Agency. And part of it went to Berkeley at the University of California and became the Institute of Personality Research and Assessment. And it began that's really where the operations of psychological warfare began, in this post-war period, where there was a shift. If you went to high school and college in America, you're given the story that the United States beat Nazi Germany, and then everything was great after that. We were the great heroes, but it's much more complicated than that, because there were many very powerful factors in the United States, industry and banking and government that were pro-Nazi. This will circle back to Wasson too, but Frank wrote in his autobiography, No Rootless Flower, about he and Tim began to realize that they were working for the CIA and that they had just fought a war against totalitarianism. But here these were, government funds coming into these eager psychologists at Berkeley who were, asked to design tests so they could, predict and control human behavior, basically. Tim writes a very important chapter in his book, The Intelligence Agents. And I think that chapter is called The Federal Bureaucracy. I really should put that on my website too. But nobody cared. Nobody really cared because, they still like this idea of we're the greatest, American exceptionalism. We beat the Nazis. We're the beacon of freedom and democracy in the world. Getting offered money from the government was very flattering. And so this was happening. But so Frank, Jolly West, Frank then, after Berkeley to Harvard, he had a period of time at the University of Minnesota when Jolly West was there, and they knew each other. And I really would like to explore in what way did they know each other. But Frank, who was one of the kindest, very introverted, shy, super brilliant guy. I loved him like a father. He spoke very frankly to me, I thought. But he said to me that Jolly West was one of the few people in the world that he knew that he could just say was unequivocally evil. So that always kind of stuck in my mind as I advanced through this career. And I don't know, I'm thinking of telling a kind of funny story.
Please, yeah.
About one time that I confronted Jolly West in public.
Wow.
And it was in October of 1993. And I was a director of what was called the Albert Hoffman Foundation. A group had gathered in Los Angeles to try to create an archive and library of psychedelic material. And Albert Hoffman asked me if I would be a director of it. And so I commuted to LA. I was there a lot. That's a whole nother story. But anyway, that fall, October 93, there was a symposium at UCLA, the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute, where Jolly West was like a very prominent figure. And so they had a symposium. This was the 50th anniversary of LSD. And so they had this symposium like commemorating hallucinogens, and it was very psychiatric, like what have we learned in psychiatry about these drugs. And Jolly West was this big fat guy, was presiding over this in-house conference of all these psychiatrists and interns and medical students. And it was a very boring symposium, but he came out at the end and he said, just kind of dismissed. He said, LSD, there were a lot of us very excited about it, in the 60s and 50s, and talked a little bit about the psychiatric stuff with serotonin. And then he said, but then Timothy Leary got involved, and we all saw what a burnout he became. And we realized that psychedelic drugs didn't have much to teach us anymore, and just kind of, and then that was it. And he started to walk off the stage. Well, I was in the audience with Oscar Janiger, who was this very famous Beverly Hills shrink. He wasn't really a shrink. He was really an osteopath, but somehow got an MD and was a psychiatrist, but didn't really have the training, and was the guy who gave LSD to a lot of Hollywood celebrities. He was also a guy that was treated. I lived at his house. He treated me like his grandson.
He treated Cary Grant, right? Was that one of his patients?
Well, he was part of the group. Yeah, I actually read Cary Grant's handwritten session reports, and Jack Nicholson, and lots of famous people. And and but Oz, I called him, was so I was interested in the effects of drugs. And so Oz would prescribe things to me. And I was also, like I said, a golfer, and I was interested in the performance enhancing properties of drugs, a whole range of drugs like, dexedrine or Ritalin or Prozac. So Oz would write me these prescriptions, and I would, just like experiment with these drugs for a period of, a few weeks or months. But so anyway, this symposium, I was in the middle of my Prozac experiment. And you may know that Prozac sometimes kind of makes you, I was sort of unchecked. And I would, anyway, I'm usually very shy, but after Jolly West said this about Timothy Leary, who at this point had become my friend, and I really admired him, and just calling him a burned out guy when, although there were aspects of that, I loved the guy. It was very insulting. So I stood up from the back of this auditorium as Jolly West is walking off the stage. And I said, well, you take questions now? And the whole audience kind of turned around and looked at me because, this is medical school, and like Jolly West ran the place, and these doctors are so, thirsty for their careers. They would never question authority. But I just stood up and I said, will you take questions now? And he kind of looked at me. He was no longer behind the podium, and he was just like right in the middle of the stage, trying to get off the stage. And I said, questions now? And I said, since you meant, and I knew all this stuff that we talked about Jolly West being, killing Jack Ruby and lots of other things with MK Ultra. If you read the very important book, I'm sure you have, Acid Dreams, yes. Very important book by my friend Martin Lee. Jolly West did lots of really nasty shit with acid, and this is, he doesn't even get into this stuff with Manson, but just like, loading people up and killing elephants and crazy shit. And I said, since you mentioned getting burned out on LSD, I wonder if you could say something about the LSD research that you did for the CIA. And he looked at me like, who the fuck are you? And this is the funny thing. So he's trying to walk off the stage, and he's standing there, and all of a sudden he just goes like this. He puts his hands like right over his balls. Body language just cracked me up. And then he just tried to deny that he worked for the CIA. He had some platitude like, well, the Russians were experimenting with psychedelic drugs, so we had to do it. It was totally defensive. And, in spite of those reports, I never had anything to do with that. And it was just, it was a hilarious thing. I can't believe I did it. I confronted this cold-blooded killer in public, and Oz took me off of Prozac right after that episode.